So that's what's really unique about Cyberwell, is that we're an initiative fighting anti-Semitism like many other nonprofits are, but we're really doing it according to the rules of the platforms themselves. So we only provide content and analysis according to their rules. That's why we say Cyberwell is an online anti-Semitism compliance solution. And when the platforms understand that you understand their rules, how their teams work and what their teams need, we see that the cooperation and response level goes up significantly. Now, there are still decisions to be made, right? And sometimes we get it wrong. We actually learn from their input on what's not considered policy violating, and it informs the way that we work and changes that we would ask for. In terms of the response rate of social media platforms, we've actually seen that the gap is closing more and more. When we started the work in 2022, the average rate of removal of reported anti-Semitic content was sitting at about 20%. From our data, we've seen that with consistent data sharing and working with the platforms, the average rate of removal of reported anti-Semitic content has gone up to an average of 50%. Similarly, because we've been doing this work in English and Arabic, we're closing the enforcement gap between the languages. So how are social media platforms relying more on technology? Part of the reason that the rates of removal have increased is because they are using AI within their own platforms to better identify when content is violating. So what Cyberwell wants to do is really leverage this new opportunity that generative AI brings, take the high integrity data that we have, and actually work on an AI agent to better identify anti-Semitism that violates policy.
All right, Tal-Or, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Really appreciate you coming all the way here, and both to share your story, but also for us to talk about something that's really, really important. So hearing about the formation of Cyberwell, and then talking about what's happening online. And it's old news to say that the discourse and the town hall is happening online on our news feeds and the echo chambers that we're surrounded by. And over the last few years, I think we've all experienced a spike, not only in misinformation in general, but in hate speech, and specifically in our part of the world around Zionism and Judaism, not only on October 7th, but also the Holocaust. And so we'll talk about all that. But again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, your journey leading up to founding Cyberwell.
Okay, so I'm the founder and CEO of Cyberwell. I also like to say that I'm a lawyer by training and not by personality, which means that I originally was working as a lawyer here in Israel. Even though you can tell by my accent, I'm not originally from here. I made Aliyah to Israel in 2009, so I've been here for about 15 years. And I started off my career as a lawyer working primarily in high tech and corporate, and also a little bit in private banking. And I was working in the field for a couple of years, and I just felt like this is not what I came to Israel for. And actually, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting that happened in the United States in the Pittsburgh area is kind of what caused me to ask myself some questions like, is this really what I want to do? And can I be doing something else? And I found myself in a pivot to the open source intelligence and business intelligence space. And because of what was happening in the United States with the rise of anti-Semitism, I was kind of put on that beat. I was focusing a lot on extremist movements in the United States, anti-Semitism in kind of darker channels, hate crime reporting, hate crime legislation. And then what I noticed when I was leading these large-scale research projects, I just noticed a very clear migration of deeply anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and content into the mainstream social media platforms. And this was back in 2018, 2019, and I was watching this happening. And as a lawyer, I was kind of asking myself, what is the difference between a dark channel or a gray channel and a mainstream social media platform? And one of the answers is that the mainstream social media platforms actually have a rule book, right? They have this whole cottage industry of trust and safety, the rules and regulations that the platforms have evolved to kind of police themselves. But it seemed like they were really failing to enforce when it came to anti-Semitism. So I thought, what if we take OSINT and AI that was available at that time and this element of compliance and create a compliance solution for the major social media platforms? And that is how Cyberwell was born.
Very, very cool. the world of responsibility and accountability on content moderation has evolved and shifted. I think in a few ways over the last few years. I've been experiencing it from the sidelines with friends from the likes of ActiveFence and other different takedown groups, and it's been really interesting watching these trends from the side. I remember that Meta very openly discussed the retreating from their content moderation efforts
recently.
Pretty recently. I think they even let go of a bunch of teams working in that space. Can you walk me through a little bit about how does this responsibility playing out today with the platforms, or what has been the evolution of this responsibility?
Right. So the tech space, and specifically the social media space, as we mentioned, has this self-regulating area called trust and safety. It's covering the way that platforms essentially want to police their own content, user-generated content, what content can be amplified, what content can be published. It covers everything from hate speech to child pornography, sale of illegal goods, copyright violations, so all different types of content. And because this space is largely unregulated, primarily in the United States because of Section 230, you really have this self-regulating industry when it comes to this content policing effort, okay? So that being the case, that it's unregulated, we've also seen different swings, trends, and different levels of investment in this space, kind of depending on who the administration is at the time. So the recent change into the changes that were announced at Meta in January was very much in line with this kind of new alignment with the Trump administration, but also taking some new best practices that were rolled out first on X. For example, this whole element of community notes is something that's very in line with the trends of how platforms prefer to police themselves. So we see platforms moving a lot into labeling content, especially in the misinformation and disinformation space, with kind of a warning or some guidance to the content consumer about what you are actually seeing. And that's a big shift right now in terms of the way that platforms are actually highlighting or treating different content. The other thing that we've seen is, instead of removing content, if possible, a platform will prefer to limit the exposure of negative or violating content. So limiting how many times a piece of content is viewed. But there are a whole bunch of questions there, especially for you mentioned, we recently here in Israel were living through the digital reality of how did October 7th, for example, play out online, right? So I was very much monitoring the social media space at that time because of our work at Cyberwell and the work that we do with social media platforms. And what I saw on October 7th, purely online and purely on the major social media platforms, was the most successful hijacking of our most used social media apps by the terrorist group Hamas. That has very serious national security that has very serious national security implications, right? Serious national security implications when it comes to how do we expect our social media platforms to actually deal with this type of content. And in an ongoing war situation or an ongoing terrorist situation, or what we're dealing with right now, which is this major surge of anti-Semitism, there becomes a lot of questions on how do we expect platforms to take a stand against that.
Right. And I just thought that there's a new movie that's coming out called October 8th.
I'm in it.
You're in it?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. And so I
go see it.
Yes, I almost watched it last night.
It's on Amazon Prime now, I think.
On Amazon Prime. I opted for a rom-com, but
fair enough. End of day makes sense.
Yes, but it's definitely on my watch list because I remember having studied at a U.S. university. I remember vividly the discourse and the discussion, not only in the West Coast where I was taking part in, but then also on the East Coast. And obviously there was whole saga at Columbia with Shai, the Professor Shai, right?
Shai Davidai.
Right. And so there's a lot of action there, and it seemed like a lot of it was being fueled by the discourse online.
100%. 100%. Everything that you saw on the campuses, you would not have seen if it wasn't being amplified, organized, and directed.
Not at that level, at least.
Right, not on that level, with a lot of very consistent messaging and content creation in the online spaces.
So you've done a lot of drill down into the numbers. Can you share a little bit about what have we been seeing over the last 3 years?
Sure. So I can talk about what we've been seeing over the last 3 years and then how that's actually shifted since October 7th. So
Please.
Online anti-Semitism was being reported by Jews across the diaspora communities, especially young Jews, but not only also Jews in Europe.
For 5,000 years.
Yes, but in the online spaces,
Yes.
directly, it was being reported as the number one form of anti-Semitism that affected them on a day-to-day basis, which makes sense because that's where we're spending most of our time. Today, American Jews are more likely to meet anti-Semitism online than they are anywhere else. In fact, 67% of them in the last year reported experiencing online anti-Semitism. Now, what does that actually mean for them? And what does that mean for us as Jewish people? That means that 1 in 3 of young people who experience online anti-Semitism will take active steps to hide their Jewish identity, up to and including changing between profiles, one that says that I'm a Jew, one that says that I'm not a Jew. 1 in 5 people will experience the feelings of their physical safety being compromised. So this was reported as being an issue from before. And then after October 7th, according to CyberWell's data, which I should back up and maybe explain what CyberWell is, we're the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism. We've been consistently monitoring the major social media platforms for anti-Semitism in both English and in Arabic since 2022. So what we saw on October 7th was a near doubling in the amount of anti-Semitic content online, with a very clear shift into additional calls to violence, where calls to violence, blatant calls to violence, were below 10% before October 7th. After October 7th, they reached double digits, and 61% of content that we were monitoring in Arabic was consistent with calls to violence or justifying violence against Jewish people. And the ripple effects of that have been that overall, the best performing tropes right now against Jews characterize them as the enemy, characterize them as evil. So from an anti-Semitism research perspective, why is that very concerning to us is because that's very clear in-group, out-group messaging. And that type of messaging is what breeds hostility, and a minimum, not only hostility, but indifference to hostility against Jews. And historically, that's kind of a tipping point issue for us.
It resonates a lot with what happened in World War II, right?
Exactly.
The similar strategy.
Exactly. And historically, I think, again, why I'm very into the approaches of how technology and AI can actually serve as a solution to this issue is because if we looked at World War II, right, there was no systematic way to fix Der Stürmer, the Nazi news syndicate, which was in 1 million copies of circulation before the Nazis were elected. There were 4 million radios in German homes, right? But these things are actually systems. And all of the technology and all of the policies and all of the potential that generative AI gives us is a potential to actually fix the system. You can make systematic impact if you standardize and you're optimizing your response of a social media platform to this issue.
And what does the response look like today? So we'll get to the discovery portion in a minute in the classification, but let's say that there is something that we see that doesn't adhere to the playbook or the rules that these platforms are putting out there, which hopefully they're in line with not posting calls to violence, not posting anti-Semitic content. What can we do about it?
Right. So CyberWell measures the impact that we have by working directly with the social media platforms. We're looking for 3 primary things. We're looking to drive up the level of enforcement of the existing policies. We're looking to improve digital policies against anti-Semitism. So I can give you a clear example of that, which is we working directly with TikTok brought TikTok to be the first social media platform to recognize that October 7th denial is a form of prohibited content on TikTok's platform. Now, the second that a policy decision like that is made, there are technological resources that are dedicated to it, there are human resources that are dedicated to it, and you see systematic change over time. In the first 3 weeks following October 7th, CyberWell did the first organization to do deep dive reports about the October 7th denial campaign. We saw that the rates of removal or action by the platforms were below 9%. After consistently working with the social media platforms, and that means sharing data with them, sharing data sets with them, keywords, repeat accounts, repeat audio that was used in order to consistently deny the events of October 7th, we saw that the rates of removal went up to an average of 40% at 6 months following the attack. So that shows how the policy change actually can incrementally improve their response over time.
And this is an independent policy change. It's not a regulatory change. It's a
TikTok policy change. Right. They made the decision, but it was based off of Cyberwell's data and Cyberwell's partnership. So we're looking for enforcement of the existing rules, improving the policies to account for modern forms of anti-Semitism or hate, right? And then we're also looking for prevention or containment. So prevention and containment, which is, I think, where most platforms focus on right now, is how do we identify content that has the potential to cause violence or call to violence, limiting that by removing it from recommendation feeds, by limiting its viewership, etc. And that's another thing that's important to remember about the recent Meta announcement. The recent Meta announcement was talking about removing the auto filters for preemptive removal of content, meaning take it down, which accounted for about 1% of all content that was removed by Meta. But it didn't talk about at all is the preemptive filters that would limit the exposure of that content. So the same things based off of keywords and based off of data sets, you could put out hateful content into the ether of Meta and potentially have it not seen whatsoever. So really what Cyberwell is about as a trusted partner, and again, we're a nonprofit, but we're really optimizing this status of a nonprofit trusted partner that works with the social media platforms, is about sharing solutions to optimize and standardize the way that social media platforms respond to this issue.
Help me unpack this issue of classification for a minute, because it sounds like once you've identified a piece of content that should be taken down according to Cyberwell, there was the increase of removal rating of up to 40%, right? In part based on the policies that the TikTok has put in. What happened? What's the other 60% about? So and what's the process there of trying to distinguish, is this in policy or out of policy, and where does technology fit in to make that assessment?
All right. So that's what's really unique about Cyberwell, is that we're an initiative fighting anti-Semitism like many other nonprofits are, but we're really doing it according to the rules of the platforms themselves. So we only provide content and analysis according to their rules. That's why we say Cyberwell is an online anti-Semitism compliance solution. And when the platforms understand that you understand their rules, how their teams work and what their teams need, we see that the cooperation and response level goes up significantly. Now, there are still decisions to be made, right? And sometimes we get it wrong. We actually learn from their input on what's not considered policy violating, and it informs the way that we work and changes that we would ask for. In terms of the response rate of social media platforms, we've actually seen that the gap is closing more and more. When we started the work in 2022, the average rate of removal of reported anti-Semitic content was sitting at about 20%. From our data, we've seen that with consistent data sharing and working with the platforms, the average rate of removal of reported anti-Semitic content has gone up to an average of 50%. Similarly, because we've been doing this work in English and Arabic, we're closing the enforcement gap between the languages. So how are social media platforms relying more on technology? Part of the reason that the rates of removal have increased is because they are using AI within their own platforms to better identify when content is violating. So what Cyberwell wants to do is really leverage this new opportunity that generative AI brings, take the high integrity data that we have, and actually work on an AI agent to better identify anti-Semitism that violates policy.
So it sounds like a part of the success has been, which by the way sounds like a really impactful work, and it sounds like a part of it has been attributed to the fact that there is increased trust between Cyberwell, and that is both due to your work with them, your ongoing communication, but it sounds like you're positioning Cyberwell as an ally, as an extension really of their existing efforts. You're following their playbooks, and I guess there is also room for discussion on how to improve on those playbooks once you're allies. And so it sounds like there may be interesting instances where there is some controversial pieces that you then want to learn from each other on whether that constitutes as a violation or not, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the platforms were very challenged during the October 7th events.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've seen different different discourses on statements. I remember there was some controversy around the statement "from the river to the sea." Is this a call to violence or not? Remember, there were different opinions on what that meant.
Right, but platforms have to make decisions about innocuous content all the time. I'll give you an example from other research that I did that was related to QAnon. Right, so QAnon, that conspiracy theory had this slogan, "Where we go one, we go all." The second that there was a consensus or there was enough indication that that innocuous, non-violating slogan was potentially violent or was going to be used to call for violence, social media platforms removed that very much at scale. They were closing entire groups. If you had that as a group slogan, your group would be closed. So platforms are aware that languages change all the time, that slogans that don't necessarily hit you over the head as violent or a threat can be used to perpetuate violence. And I think increasingly as the social media platforms rely more on video and rely more on visual cues, I mean, one of the biggest issues that platforms are still scratching their heads on how to enforce is the inverted red triangle, which is a symbol of Hamas, right? And you saw that show up across all of the campuses. It showed up online first. It was iconicized online first.
Interesting. I guess a part of the challenge is how do you scale this monitoring and this classification to get to a point where you actually have coverage? And that sounds like really, really big effort, even, of course, for humans, but even technologically requires a lot of resources.
Right.
How does Cyberwell deal with the actual task of monitoring and scanning for these types of content?
Yeah, we used a host of different technology-based solutions, and I think again, generative AI presents additional opportunities, and it's up to initiatives like Cyberwell to outsize the opportunity and minimize the risk, because we know there are bad actors that are leveraging these technologies for really, really bad usage. So we use a host of different, I would say, primitive AI, open source intelligence tools, and really expertise. But to me, that's, again, the opportunity of generative AI and agent AI is you can take expertise, a very specific methodology about anti-Semitism identification and policy violation, and create a solution that is scalable. It's a challenge for us, especially as a nonprofit. It's a different kettle of fish, and I very much try as much as I can to learn from industry leaders and private sector leaders on how we can grow Cyberwell like a business. But it's a new territory, but you got to try, because I remember when I was doing anti-Semitism research and I got familiar with all the legacy organizations, and I just saw that this entire industry, the social media and tech space, just wasn't being serviced at all with any kind of anti-Semitism solution. And I thought it was a massive oversight. So I'm very proud of what we've built, and also the team and the work that we do. And I know how much of a resource we are for these people and for the decision makers at the platform. And I think it's an amazing thing.
So where are we heading to from here? What does the next couple of years look like for Cyberwell?
The next couple of years is leveraging generative AI with our high integrity data around anti-Semitism to create the first online anti-Semitism compliance algorithm. That's our main focus technologically, but we're also very much focused on expanding into additional platforms. What are the platforms of impact? From a professional perspective, you could say LinkedIn. From a campus perspective, you can say Yik Yak. It's the possibilities are endless. And we've seen a real value also into multiple languages. 90% of the anti-Semitism efforts are only focused on English. Anti-Semitism is a global problem. And we know from a content moderation perspective, actually the enforcement is very poor on languages outside of English. So those are some of the expansion kind of vectors for us, and to scale Cyberwell to its fullest potential as a trusted partner for social media and big tech in this space.
Well, it's a super important problem, and it sounds like already over the last few years you've had a significant impact. And it sounds like the better the work that you do, the less we will see of it online.
Hopefully, that's the goal.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And thank you so much for coming here and for sharing the story.
Thank you.
And we're all championing for it. So thank you.